And obviously, we've been going over what? What have we been going over? Review. We've been going over a review in John. So, and we are up to chapter 11. So this is new material this morning. So we are going to go over the resurrection of Lazarus. And the title is Death by Design. And we'll get into the reasoning for the title. So we're going to read it, and then we're going to look at the context, what's been going on, which will tie back into a little bit of review, and then we're going to examine the resurrection of Lazarus. So it's in John chapter 11, and we're going to read 1 to... Okay, so we're going to read 1 to 16. So John chapter 11, 1 to 16. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sister sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, the one whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed there 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because there is not light in him. This he said after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go that I may awaken him out of sleep. The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And I'm glad for your sake that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Therefore Thomas, who was called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, so that we may die with him. Okay, so where is Jesus when this word comes to him? This was the last part of our review. In chapter 10, ends out with, he is where? He has traveled back across the Jordan to the place where John the Baptist had started baptizing. Right? That's where he is. And we know that what has taken place just previous to that, to give further context, was the Feast of Dedication, where Jesus had said that he and the Father were one, right? And he talked about the sheep, and there was the confrontation. We pointed back to Psalm 82, and there is the confrontation about, has he not said in your law that you are gods, right? And he goes further on to point to himself and the Father as being one, and they have picked up stones to stone him. So the situation is that Jesus has escaped from the Jewish leaders. He has gone across the Jordan, and it is well known to all of the people that the Jewish leaders want to kill him. That up until this point, attempts to kill Christ or to arrest him have been spontaneous and mob-led, right? That they have just been, he says something like, before Abraham was, I am, and they pick up stones to stone him. But it has not been a formal arrest and conviction before the Sanhedrin, right? There has not been any formal charge laid against him. And so this is where we are in this, and the reasoning for their wanting to kill him was obviously his message, his methods. the confrontation that he has with them, and his growing popularity. Those are the motivating factors for them to want to kill him. Because his message indicates both that he is God and that he is the Messiah, right? And so the Jews obviously do not want him to be the Messiah. He doesn't fit with their mold, and they're afraid of the Romans. We know that already. We know that his methods is that he has been healing on the Sabbath, and by appearances and by their traditions, he has been breaking the Sabbath. And he has been confronting the Jewish leaders on the basis of their injustice and in their unbelief. And he has been directly confronting them, calling them children of the devil, right? And obviously they're not taking that too well. And in addition to that, he has a growing popularity because of the miracles, because of his message, and we would probably say to a certain extent because of his confrontation to authority, right? Because people are drawn to that by their sinful nature, that they like it when there is this opposition to authority figures. And so when you get somebody who's a rebel, wow, that's wonderful. I'll throw this question out. Was Jesus a rebel? It is a kind of a trick question, because he did obviously oppose, in a certain way, those people who were in authority. But those people in authority were put there by God, and he is God. He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so he is not actually rebellious or a rebel. He could not be rebellious or a rebel because he is the one who has rightful authority. So we have to be careful when you hear some people talk about Jesus being a rebel, and that is not technically true. Okay, so that's our context. He has been confronted, and there has been again an attempt on his life, and he has gone across the Jordan where he remains. Okay, so the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that this is really close to the time of the crucifixion. We are really rapidly approaching the crucifixion. And so he is outside Jerusalem, he is across the Jordan, and one of the themes of this particular passage are obviously his divinity, it is prayer, it is the plan of God, it is the pain of suffering, and the issue of death and resurrection. Right? Those are the things that we want to pay attention to in this passage. So, some of the things that you might ask are things like this. Why is the resurrection of Lazarus not in the synoptics? Like, why is it included in John? Like, this seems like, to us, from our perspective, this seems like a hugely major miracle that is completely omitted from the synoptics. Now, we don't have a definitive answer to that, but what do you think might be a reason why Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't include the resurrection of Lazarus? Okay, so John has a particular message that he wants to convey, and that's why he picks this. Yes, Corey? So this is a very particular miracle to John's message, right? And I would agree with you that obviously John says that if all of the things that Christ had done had been included, the world would not contain the books, right? That the number of miracles that were performed by Jesus were huge. There was a vast number of miracles, right? We remember that Lazarus is not the only person that Jesus raised from the dead, right? So he had he'd done tons of miracles, and obviously there is selective editing by the writers of the New Testament, by the Gospels, on the miracles that they included for the purpose of the message that they were giving. One of the reasons I think that might be there are two things that I think might come into play in this. One is obviously that the number of miracles were great, and this one was just one of many, and so the other writers didn't include it. We see it as a big one, but to them it might not have had the same emphasis, right? That there are other miracles. And one of the reasons why they might not have included it is that this one is open more to the charge of confederacy than the other resurrections. What do I mean by that? What is a confederate? Well, not in the southern versus northern aspect, but what is a confederate? Do you know what that means? Okay, so when you see these faith healers, right? And they call to the audience for someone to come down who is, crippled, lame, blind, whatever, has a tumor, whatever, and there is a pouring down of people, right? Many of those people, if not all of those people, are confederates. That means they're in on the trick. That's what a confederate is. When somebody does a magic trick, a confederate is one who already is in on the trick. They're a participant in the trick to make it look believable. They're an actor, right? No. Confederate just means that you're along with. The Confederacy was a joining together of the southern states, right? Well, you're joined together with this person who is performing the trick. And so this miracle, since Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were all good friends of Jesus, that this miracle might have been open to the charge that it wasn't a real miracle, that Lazarus was in on it. Whereas the other resurrections were strangers. And so when they're having a funeral procession through the city, and it's the widow's son, and Jesus resurrects the widow's son, he doesn't know them, right? He doesn't have any interaction with them, and so it appears that, or it is, that person is not a confederate. But you could say that perhaps the charge might have gone out that Lazarus was a confederate and he wasn't really dead. He was just hiding out in the tomb till Jesus got there, right? That might be a reason. The other reason why John includes this, and this will come out later on, is that John has an insight into the inner workings of the Jewish leadership, particularly the priests, that's going to come out in the second part of this, where he knows things that went on in the back room that the other apostles, the other writers of the New Testament would not be privy to. He was in communication with the priesthood because he was known to them. He had interaction with them, right? And he would have knowledge of what went on in the back room that the other writers of the New Testament would not. And this particular miracle is incredibly tied to that, right? It has a big implication for the actions of the Sanhedrin. Okay? So those might be reasons why John includes this miracle and it's not included in the synoptics. Okay, so now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. The opening tells us what about the story about Mary and Martha? What does it assume? That the reader, this is again an example in John that he assumes the reader knows these stories. He's saying, this is Mary and Martha. You all know from the synoptics who that was. Right? You're all familiar with who Mary and Martha was. You all know the story of Jesus being anointed and the woman wiping his feet with her hair. You know that story, and so you're familiar with these things. I am fleshing out the story for purpose that you already know. Right? I am giving you information about people that you're already familiar with because you already know the Gospels. Right? And the story of the ointment, this is the Mary who wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. What is that story? What's that? In Simon the leper's house. There are 3 stories. There's one in Matthew, one in Mark, and one in Luke. And they are all about Jesus being anointed, right? But this particular one John is referring to relates to Matthew and Mark's account, not Luke's. Luke's account is the one that if you remember, is where Jesus goes to have a meal at the Pharisee's house, and the woman of immoral character comes and starts weeping and wiping Jesus' feet with her hair, wiping the tears on his feet. Right? That's that story. That's not what this is talking about. The other 2 accounts in Matthew and Mark are the story of Jesus being anointed with costly perfume, right? Costly ointment, and his preparation for burial. Those are those 2 instances. So the one in Luke is separate. Now, where this gets confusing and a little bit conflated is that the ones where he is anointed don't mention that Mary has wiped his feet with her hair, and the one with the Pharisee mentions that the woman wipes his feet with her hair. So there is obviously liberals latch on to that and see that it's not consistent. But there's no reason to think that it's not consistent. It just means that there is an emphasis in these stories on the ointment, and there is an emphasis on this story on wiping his feet with her hair, right? What would be the significance, if you think about it, what's the significance of wiping his feet with her hair? It would definitely be humility, but what is the glory of a woman? Her hair. And what is the most disgusting thing in Jewish culture? Your feet. Right? So if a woman takes her glory and wipes feet with her hair, that is a huge example of humility. Huge. Right? And so the fact that Mary poured this really expensive ointment onto Jesus' feet and then wiped his feet with her hair, that is a big, big deal. A big deal. Okay. What's that? Yes, sir? That's a good question. Why do you guys think? I think more to the point is he is saying that you guys know these people from these stories, right? You know Mary and Martha, and you know the story of the ointment. But when he relates it later on, he's putting it into context, into timeline, right, for starters. So he's basically telling you this instance of Lazarus' resurrection happens before the ointment story, right? And the other thing is that he's telling us that he's fleshing out the ointment story when he tells it, right? Because he emphasizes what, we're going to go over this, but what aspect of the ointment story does he really emphasize? It's not very nice. he emphasizes the fact that Judas kept the money purse and used to steal from it. That's not included in the other ones. All that's included in the other ones is that there was somebody who said, couldn't this have been sold for a lot of money and the money given to the poor? But John emphasizes that he wasn't concerned about the poor at all, and it was Judas who said it, and what he was really concerned with was getting the cash. And this lets you know where Judas's heart was and what was one of the motivating factors for him turning in Christ. Right? That is, John wants to flesh that out for us. Right? So that is one of the reasons why he mentions it here, to give you a tie to who these people are. And then he tells you the story later on because he wants to flesh that out and put it in timeline context. Okay? What do we do for that? Good. All right, so in verse 3 it says, "So the sisters sent word to him, saying, 'Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick.'" I really like this. It reminds you of John 2:3, where Mary comes to Jesus at the wedding. And what does she say to him? Nope, she doesn't actually. What does she say? She doesn't say you're capable of doing this. What does she say? No. We're talking in 2:3, right? John 2:3, the feast, or the wedding feast. And Mary comes to Jesus and says what? They have no wine. Now, this is prayer, right? This is prayer. Jesus is God, right? And they come to Jesus. Have you ever been in this situation where, in my case, Dad, my car won't start? Or, Dad, the basement is flooding. Right? There is no request there. There is no, you got to do something. There's no, hey, please do this. There is none of that. This is a statement of fact with expectation. And I think that's incredible because it really points to the faith. The faith is, if I make Jesus aware of this, He'll do something. If I make Jesus aware that they don't have any wine, I don't have to badger Him. I don't have to explain that He has to do something or tell Him what to do. All I have to do is make Him aware of the situation and He'll handle it. That's the faith that is exhibited here. Lord, the one you love is sick. Boom. And I expect that you will act. I don't have to tell you how to handle it. You know how to handle it. You know what needs to be done, and you will handle it correctly. I anticipate that. That's where my faith is. And it's that kind of faith. It's, Lord, this is the situation. Now, is that the way we're always supposed to pray? Obviously not. Obviously, there are myriads of examples in Scripture where people pray in all manner of things. And Jesus teaches us to pray in a manner that includes requests. Give us this day our daily bread, right? So it includes requests, but it is neither wrong. Sometimes it's incredibly appropriate to go, Lord, this is the situation. This is how it is. And then wait upon the Lord to see what He does. Because you know He will do something. You know He will act, and the way that He acts is the best way. And sometimes we can muddle the situation because we communicate, we try to pressure God to do things. And that's not appropriate. Sometimes we just need to say, Lord, this is how it is. And just wait for Him to act. And that's what we see here. They just say, Lord, behold, He whom you love is sick. Okay. Any questions on that? Any comments? Okay, we're going to move on. Verse 5. Now Jesus loved Mary and her sister and Lazarus. Now I read some commentators, and the commentators tried to make it a universal kind of love. Right? They wanted you just to know that John included this because Jesus loves everybody. That is not what this is saying at all. There is a reason why John includes that now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Doesn't he love everybody? Okay, if this is he particularly loves Martha and her sister and Lazarus, isn't that partiality? Does Jesus love some people more than he loves others? Yes. Why do you say yes? Oh, that's true. Is that what he's getting here? Is that Mary and her sister and Lazarus were saved, and he loved them because other people weren't saved. And so that was it. Is that what John is saying? Is that the plain reading of the text? Is it? Here's another question. Is Jesus the man differing in his relationships with the people that surround him than God is? There is kind of a hesitancy on our part to think that God might have special relationships with particular individuals, but the Bible is very clear that he does.
As John said, I am the disciple he loved.
John says right 3 times at the end of the book that he is the disciple whom Jesus loved. But in the Old Testament, were there particular people that God had special relationships with? Moses was one. God spoke to him face to face as one speaks with his friend. Right? Who else? Abraham. He was called a friend of God. Who else? David. David was a man after God's own heart. Right? So, obviously, there is this, that God is not impartial, but there is a difference in relationship that God has with particular individuals. And that is stated categorically. It is not that God does not love all of his children, obviously, but he has special relationships with some of those children. And you may say that's partiality, but there is, and I've heard people have really crazy attitudes about how they should love everybody, and therefore the love that they have for their spouse shouldn't be different than the love that they have for everybody else. Well, that's not true. Right? That is categorically not true. I love my wife differently than I love Holly. Right? And that is a good thing. And it's a right thing. And it's a holy thing. Right? But God has particular relationships with particular people. And it doesn't lessen his relationship with other people that he loves and his children. But there are particular relationships that are special to him. It is complicated with God because guess who formed David the way that he was? God. Right? Abraham. It was God that formed him. Moses. God that formed him. So these relationships are with people that he particularly shaped for particular purposes at particular times. And he shaped all of their character. Yes, ma'am. Does God hate? Yes, God hates. Absolutely. The wicked every day. Right? Right. He also says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Before.
David and Jacob, their lives weren't
Yeah, that's God's grace. He's awesome. He loves me in spite of me, and I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, it's that's what I love about the Scripture. It is not shy about exposing the sin of the people who were heroes of the faith. Yes, sir. Well, we did. We talked about John calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Oh, hating reference. Well, the one about Jacob and Esau is a New Testament reference. The Nicolaitans, yes, yes. So there is references. Obviously, God hates, and so we know that He hates, but we're talking particularly in special love that He has for special people in His plan of salvation and the way He works things out. Okay, so but when Jesus heard this sickness... Oh, yeah. Okay. So, but when Jesus heard this, He said, "This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when He heard this, that he was sick, then He stayed 2 days longer in the place where He was. What I wanted to emphasize here is the complexity of God's plan. What is the stated reasoning for Jesus remaining where He was, and that the sickness is not going to end in death, but for the glory of God? And we know that Lazarus died. What was the stated reason for Him staying? Well, it's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. What are other reasons for what He did?
He waited till he began to smell, so he was dead.
Yeah, He definitely waited, but I'm talking about the motivation for the narrative. What is Jesus' motivation here? What is the reason why He is allowing Lazarus to die? He can heal from a distance. He does not have to be there, right? We know that because He heals the servant from a distance, right? You remember, He tells the guy, "Go, your servant is healed." The guy goes and asks the question of when it happened. So He can heal from a distance. He's God. Distance is nothing to Him. But He stays so that for the glory of God, so that the Son of God might be glorified. That is one reason. But then we see, so when He heard that He was sick, He stayed longer. And just a second. You have to tie that in with verse 5, which says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when He heard, He stayed." So the reason why He stayed was because He loved Martha and Lazarus and his sister. Those two verses are tied together. One of the purposes for Jesus remaining was for the sake of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. That He stayed longer for them. So there are multiple reasons, and we'll get into this next week. There are multiple reasons for this miracle. There are 3 very salient reasons for the miracle. I'll give them to you right now. One was, obviously, the display of His deity. One was for Mary and Martha and Lazarus to see the glory of God. And the other one is because this is a necessary component of moving things along according to the timeline that God had set for the crucifixion. And all of those, so we don't want to miss the part for the whole, right? Or we don't want to miss the whole for the part, right? We don't want to focus on just one aspect, because we often do that and miss the complexity of multiple motivations that God acts on. Okay, We're done.